Clear orbital corridor. Code 8 Delta. Unknown diplomatic vessel entering designated vector, the Nexus Command Center announced, the words cutting across the observation deck like a sharpened blade. No warning, no escort. Just a sleek human transport breaking through the station's perimeter like it belonged there. Inside the operations dome, Chief Warden Crex Malor blinked his lateral eyelids once, then twice. His species, the foreign, didn't startle easily, but the way that craft moved, silent, deliberate, unhurried, triggered something instinctual. Not fear, something colder, misdirected certainty. Identity confirmed, the station AIEDRA intoned. Ambassador Draiven Holt, human designation, solo delegate, no crew, no armaments. Of course, Mailer muttered, adjusting the neural sync strap embedded beneath his carapace. They send one. The docking bay hissed as the human shuttle extended its landing struts. Automated clamps locked into place with a low thud that reverberated through the floor. As the hull pressurized and the entrance ramp descended, the scent of treated oxygen mingled with sterile coolant and the faint trace of carbon graphite, a purely human chemical signature, one that always seemed to linger longer than it should. Draiven Holt emerged clad in tailored black, no insignia, no armor, just clean lines, deliberate steps, and an expression so unreadable it unsettled the retinal overlays of the receiving drones. He carried a worn leather portfolio under one arm. In his other hand, a thin, rectangular silver case. "Visual confirmation," muttered Security Officer Yev Vol, standing beside Malor. "Still no biometric anomalies. He's unarmed." Malor narrowed his gaze. "That doesn't mean he's harmless." The docking chamber felt colder now, not due to temperature, climate controls were fixed, but because Holt had a way of drawing space into himself, like gravity reversed. Eyes turned. Conversations paused. Even the low chatter of the support crew dimmed into nothing. "Ambassador Holt," Mailer greeted as the human approached. "Welcome to Nexus. We trust the journey was uneventful?" Holt offered a smile without warmth. "Uneventful trips are usually the most important ones." His voice was calm, the cadence eerily even. There was no dramatic inflection, no performative gravitas. Just presence, a presence that felt calculated in its simplicity. "Standard clearance protocols must be completed," Malor said. "You understand." "I'd be disappointed if they weren't." Malor led him through a corridor flanked by sensor arrays, biometric scanners, retinal calibration points, microfield resonance traps, and radiation diffraction fields. Holt passed through each one without pause. No alerts, no signatures, not even a stray skin anomaly. The scanners read nothing more dangerous than human cells and clean-cut suit fabric. Still, Mailer watched closely. There was something off in the way Holt moved, not military but not diplomatic either. He walked like someone who had long since accepted being underestimated and made it a weapon. Inside the observation ring overlooking the obsidian chamber, Counselor Varn Julik leaned over the edge of the translucent dais, his clawed fingers tapping slowly against the edge of a projection node. "They sent one," he murmured, his breath fogging the glass for just a moment before vanishing. "Again." Minister Draxel Morin exhaled in amusement. "Symbolism. They cling to it. One man against 12 systems, as if willpower alone negates unity." "Or they've run out of diplomats," muttered Sub-Minister Belk Trevik. "Would explain why this one looks like he's heading to a wake." On the floor below, Holt's gaze lifted, briefly catching Ulik's through the ceiling's refractive layer. His stare wasn't defiant. It wasn't aggressive. It simply was. Observing, not reacting. A mirror held up to power, showing it what it wanted to see, and quietly measuring the gap between perception and truth. After the final security scan, Mailer gestured toward the transport pad. "You'll be escorted to the summit chamber." "I know the way," Holt replied evenly, stepping past the guide drone, waiting to receive him. The drone hesitated for a moment. Its guidance algorithm briefly stalled, as if unsure whether to follow, lead, or get out of the way. Ulick turned from the glass. He carries no comlink, no encryption lens, not even a retinal HUD. He's not augmented? Morin asked. Trevek scoffed. They must be mocking us. Holt's approach through the inner corridors was quiet, but not empty. The walls flickered occasionally with deep-seated plasma conduits. Air purifiers hummed, not in sound but in vibration, barely perceptible as a fingertip buzz along the steel flooring. From a side hall, 2 surveillance units tracked his motion. Holt didn't glance at them. A pair of junior attendants watched him pass. One whispered something, perhaps a joke about Earthlings, but stopped halfway through the sentence. Holt didn't say a word. He simply placed his silver case on a console table beside the chamber entrance, as if he belonged there, as if the object did too. The obsidian chamber loomed ahead, constructed from raw volcanic glass, harvested from the crust of US-4, its surface swallowing light like a collapsed star. Entering the chamber was like stepping into a room carved from night itself. The temperature dipped, and sound took on strange reverb, like voices speaking underwater. Holt paused just outside the doors. His fingers adjusted his collar, not out of nervousness, but precision. Then he walked forward, leaving the silver case exactly where it was. Inside the chamber, 12 alien delegates sat or hovered in a wide arc around a central grav-field platform. Each represented a galactic power block. Each had come expecting a frail, apologetic human attempting to negotiate his species back into compliance. Instead, they got Holt. Ulick was the first to break the silence. You arrive alone, without technology, without authority, and without context. Holt stepped onto the grav field, placing his leather portfolio on the table. He met Ulick's gaze, unwavering. I came without anything, he said evenly, that you can scan for. And with that, the chamber doors sealed shut behind him, not with drama, not with tension, but with the soft finality of a decision already made. The doors closed behind Draiven Holt with the finality of a verdict already rendered. Inside, silence didn't reign. It stalked. Every council member sat motionless, not out of discipline, but calculation. 12 species, 12 power blocks. None expecting a man like Holt to enter the chamber without entourage, armor, or the buffering presence of AI advisors. Yet here he stood, unhurried, his suit unwrinkled, posture unguarded, every movement so effortlessly composed that it agitated more than any aggressive display could have. He walked to the central grav field table without invitation, set his leather portfolio down as if it belonged there, then stood motionless, hands lightly resting on the edge, waiting, not asking. The chamber itself had been designed to discomfort. Obsidian panels curved inward at sharp angles, absorbing the overhead lighting in erratic blotches that fractured symmetry. Voices echoed irregularly, bouncing in ways that gave words unintended tones, accusation where there was none, disdain where neutrality was intended. It was a place meant to unsettle. Holt looked mildly bored. Above, heads-up projectors flared to life in sequence, bathing the periphery with pulsing species sigils and current sector alignments. On each delegate's pedestal, laser plasma displays activated silently, casting sharp projections of trade flows, border disputes, cultural influence maps, and planetary interest shifts, every one of them pulsing with one common thread: human involvement. Councillor Varn Ulick broke the silence. I trust Earth's representative has brought something more than dramatic flair. His voice carried the rehearsed cadence of superiority, the type that comes not from strength, but the long decay of a power too comfortable with its own weight. I bring paper, Holt said, flipping open the portfolio and withdrawing a folded sheet. Shall we start with boundaries? Sub-Minister Belk-Travick let out a dry, mechanical chuckle, his throat vents twitching with disdain. Paper, of course, Ulick raised an eyebrow. This chamber recognizes Earth's request to discuss territorial clarity. However, before that formality, I think we'd all appreciate understanding how a single species, barely 3 generations into Confederation membership, has managed to exert disproportionate influence over sectors long considered politically stable. He turned slightly, addressing the room more than the human. Their music floods our broadcasts. Their consumer goods dominate frontier economies. Their humanitarian vessels dock in quarantine zones before official clearance is processed. Their presence multiplies. Holt didn't speak immediately. He simply watched Ulick with an expression that lacked either amusement or irritation, just intent observation. Finally he said, "You speak of presence as if it were invasion. Perhaps the issue isn't where we are, but why others prefer our proximity." A murmur spread among the delegates, low, tension-laced. On the upper tier, Coordinator Vex Taldrin's optical lenses narrowed. "You arrived with no digital tools, no data streams, and now you offer a sheet of inked fiber." "It's easier to review unaltered," Holt replied. "Not everyone trusts filtered metrics." "Unaltered," Vex repeated flatly. "And unverifiable." Holt gave a slight nod. "You're welcome to cross-reference them against your own shipping logs, though I'd advise doing it soon." That last line landed oddly. Speaker Marn Etrix shifted in his suspension cradle, a tremor of violet pulsating through his bioluminescent tendrils. He was normally unshakable, mediating debates even during wartime disputes. But there was something discordant about Holt's presence. The human's voice wasn't aggressive, nor dismissive, yet it felt like pressure building beneath the floor, quiet, invisible, yet present. Ulick leaned forward, his mandibles slowly clicking together. "So you claim your influence is accidental?" Holt tilted his head slightly. "Influence often grows where incompetence recedes." The insult landed like a whispered insult across a silent room. No shouting, no dramatic accusations, just a ripple of realization. "Then let's address the encroachments," Ulick snapped. "You've tripled humanitarian deployments in the Arvalon Fringe, unauthorized. You've sponsored cultural exchange centers in systems not aligned with Earth's jurisdiction. You've opened trade with the Irix Conclave before their council approved the trade block extension. What do you call this, Ambassador?" "Necessary corrections," Holt replied. The silence this time was thicker. Not shock, but adjustment. Holt wasn't here to defend Earth. He was here to establish its position without apology. Vex Taldrin slammed a data rod onto his projection panel. Unverified shipping manifests. Civilian craft with concealed medical hulls, smuggling under the guise of aid. I have entire subnets flagged for Earth origin anomalies. Holt calmly reached into the portfolio, withdrew a second sheet, and placed it on the table. The flagged manifests you're referring to were pre-cleared by regional compliance nodes. Your own Sector A, I gave them access. You should question your internal protocols before implying deception. Taldrin's pupils contracted. The display beside him flickered, his command feed verifying Holt's statement in real time. The sub-network logs flashed green. Counselor Ulick's jaw tightened. "You seem comfortable here?" Etrix said softly, folding his luminous limbs around his torso. Holt's gaze moved toward him, steady, unblinking. "There's a reason for that," Holt said. Then, after a breath, added, "I believe some of you are about to violate your own laws, in real time." The heads of several delegates snapped toward him. "What does that mean?" barked Commander Gorturvin. His plaited tail scraped against the edge of his chair, an instinctive motion from a species bred for sudden violence. Holt didn't respond with threat. He simply shifted the first document an inch toward the center of the table. "It means," he said, "that while we talk about borders, your fleets are in motion, that your mining drones are breaching mapped boundaries, and that somewhere in your encrypted field servers, those actions are already being logged." Laser plasma displays across the room refreshed, new markers glowing red against territorial grids. No one had triggered them. No one had authorized visual updates. Ulick froze. Is this some form of psychological maneuver? Holt didn't smile. He didn't need to. The mind follows patterns, he said. So do empires. For the first time in the chamber's long, uncomfortable history, it wasn't the walls or design that induced unease. It was the man who stood at the center of it, quiet, unarmed, and absolutely certain of what came next. The red boundary markers on the laser plasma displays pulsed in silence. 12 delegates stared at them, none willing to blink first. Draiven Holt didn't look at the displays. He had already seen what he needed, in their reactions, not their data. Counselor Varn Ulick's voice snapped the quiet. "This is an engineered provocation, a demonstration of technological manipulation." Holt tilted his head, fingers steepled lightly on the table. "That's a bold theory. Are you sure you want it tested?" Before Ulick could respond, a subtle flicker passed through the ambient lighting. The chamber's neural core interface hadn't faltered, but something beneath the system had. High above them, tucked behind Nexus Station's command lattice, the AIEDRA parsed anomalies in a cascade of secondary data logs. Encrypted authorization pings were firing from various planetary terminals. The requests were oddly formatted, standard clearance headers followed by segmented packet tails. Internal requests, all valid, yet none originated from Earth. On the observatory's lower level, security systems analyst Krav Nexin felt his neural band warm against the back of his skull. Data queries were routing in loops, opening retrieval tunnels from secured archive nodes that hadn't been accessed in standard cycles. Not external intrusions, something more unnerving. The system thought these commands were familiar. He keyed into his interface. "IDRA, isolate request clusters in quadrant Delta 7. Confirm origin." The AI's voice replied smoothly. "All pings authenticated. Source, Confederation delegate terminals. No breach detected." Krav's fingers hesitated above the interface. That wasn't a glitch. That was intent. In the chamber below, Commander Gore Turvin shifted, the ridges along his forearms twitching under restrained frustration. "Your deployments on the fringe systems suggest forward staging. Are we supposed to believe you've come to talk peace while building for war?" Holt didn't rise to the bait. He simply adjusted the silver case on the table, aligning its edge with the corner of his portfolio. "We build where we're welcome. Perhaps the more relevant question is, why do your colonies keep requesting our presence?" Envoy Shar Valtrin, his thorax armor catching the low chamber light, leaned forward with a slow scrape of clawed digits against his console. "Your kind cloaks soft power in good intention. One humanitarian ship leads to a trade station. One medical drop becomes an embassy. You invade without stepping forward." Holt looked at him. "Maybe we just noticed something you didn't. Opportunity." Shar's carapace darkened in annoyance. "You dress conquest in courtesy." "You mistake cooperation for conquest?" Holt replied, his tone still as level as the chamber floor. "Which tells me more about your intentions than mine." Across the command tier, Krav Nexin saw another flag. An archival file in the Kitari diplomatic archives had been accessed, 3 cycles earlier than its scheduled decryption window. The log had automatically updated EDRA's core, pushing sensitive information into the central interface matrix. No alert had fired. The system had welcomed the file because the system believed it was invited. Krav stared at the data trail. These weren't leaks. They were reflections. mirrors activated not by intrusion, but interaction. Below, Holt's words hung like layered glass, calm on the surface, but dangerous when handled without care. Ulick pointed toward the plasma map. "You mean to say Earth had no hand in this anomaly?" "I never said that," Holt answered, folding his hands again. "I said nothing you see came from me." A ripple of unease moved through the delegates, subtle as gravity shifting underfoot. On the periphery, Speaker Marn Etrix's bioluminescent strands curled inward, the glow dimming with contemplative silence. He hadn't spoken since Holt's last remark. Something about the cadence, the quiet confidence, had triggered a sensory misalignment, like light bent at the wrong angle. Vex Teldrin's fingers moved across his interface, pulling system logs. "You're threading disinformation through station systems. That much is evident. What we don't understand is how you're triggering it without access." Holt's eyes met his without blinking. "The same way a song gets stuck in your head. You hear it, you hum it, and then you think it was yours to begin with." Gorturvan slammed a clenched fist into the side of his console. "Enough riddles. Say what you mean." Holt's tone didn't rise. "You brought everything I needed, and I didn't even ask." The chamber's light dimmed slightly, just enough for Edra's core to flash an override signal across Krav Nexon's neural interface. "Alert. Level 2. Channel breach source, Del Prime Terminal, Confederation Governmental Node. Command origin, internal, access path verified." Krav leaned back slowly. The commands were real. They weren't artificial injections. They were responses. Holt hadn't inserted anything. He'd just known what would happen when they came into contact. "Idra," he said quietly. "Log current anomaly chain under new header. Tracer protocol. Passive. Self-triggered." The AI complied. In the chamber, Char-Voltron growled. "This is engineered deceit. Earth's manipulations will be brought before the Outer Tribunal." "I'm sure they'll be fascinated to learn you handed us the keys," Holt said, voice cool enough to silence further outrage. On the displays, data began to populate from multiple systems: fleet placements, route schedules, classified trade bypasses. The map didn't expand. It clarified. Each segment labeled, each source authenticated. Not Earth's files, not human interference, internal leaks given form. Speaker Etrix spoke at last, his voice nearly a whisper. "These files are real?" "Yes," Holt replied, standing at last. "They always were. You just needed someone to help you look at them." No smugness, no triumph. Just the weight of a reality now made visible. And Draiven Holt, unarmed, unaugmented, and entirely prepared, stood at the center of the storm he'd never touched. Speaker Marn Etrix's declaration still lingered in the chamber air. "These files are real." 12 council members, each schooled in the art of political posturing, now sat trapped in stillness, because not one of them could explain how classified data had surfaced without a single external intrusion. Draiven Holt remained standing. He didn't gloat. He didn't speak. He simply tapped the edge of the silver case once with his index finger. It didn't open. It didn't flash. The gesture carried no audible cue. And yet the room shifted again, not physically but atmospherically, as if something had tilted in their collective reality. Minister Horv Soluan was the first to attempt recovery. His broad crest flared, and the scales beneath his ocular ridges took on a sharper tone. "Earth has been militarizing its fringe holdings. That's the only explanation. You've been planning a silent expansion, ceding control through covert deployments." Holt turned his gaze toward him, cool and analytical. "Interesting hypothesis," he said. "Do you mean the colonies we haven't established in 7 years? Or perhaps the ones your freighters have been circling without clearance?" Horv scoffed, but the heads-up display at his pedestal pulsed with new overlays. red transit paths traced back to his own species' trade vessels, routes that had crossed restricted Earth-administered zones. Repeatedly. Ulick leaned forward, voice low. This is theater. A game of image. You present facts without source. Anyone can fabricate these visuals. At that moment, every delegate's laser plasma display blinked, then updated. Multiple feeds, simultaneously. Not projections from Holt's device, not broadcast from any known Earth signature. Each counselor watched their own system logs populate with mirrored threads of internal authorization chains, raw encrypted command sets, and timestamps. Old secrets, pulled out like buried bones, and every file was stamped with the emblem of its origin nation. The seals were unmistakable. Speaker Atrix backed away from his console as if it had burned him. These aren't external inserts. They're our own. Gore Turvin grunted, claws tightening on the table's curved ridge. Back channels, maybe. Intercepted relays. They spliced copies into our systems, make it look internal. No, Atrix said, breathing unevenly now. These are clean streams, unbroken. End-to-end encryption signatures match our internal protocols. No jumps, no skips. They came from us. We gave them away. Holt's hand moved only slightly as he placed it atop the silver case. Not pressing, not activating, just anchoring. Your mistake, he said, tone even as still water, was believing your silence meant secrecy. The air in the room thickened, not literally, but in awareness. No one reached for a weapon. None dared move toward a console. Minister Draxel Morin stared at his feed, eyes flicking between pages of real-time document streams, now pouring into Nexus's core AI from external government terminals. Military contracts, intelligence rotas, unauthorized station deployments, all auto-validated. None of them planted. Idra, he said tightly, trace transmission source. The AI responded with terrifying clarity. Transmission cascade initiated from Tier 6 embedded system protocols, activated through behavioral loop engagement. Original source, Confederation Council terminals. Confusion seized the room. Oh, what the void is behavioral loop engagement, Travik spat, his voice uncharacteristically strained. Krav Nexon, in the control tier above, answered quietly through the chamber comms. It's a passive trigger architecture built to recognize recurring decision signatures. If someone knew how a delegation would behave under pressure, what they would say, how they'd react, they could theoretically initiate system-level responses without external interference. Ulick froze. Are you saying this human pre-coded our own systems to betray us? No, Holt replied. You did that. I just understood your patterns. A single heads-up projection snapped to center, a rotating orbital schematic. It showed 3 freighters belonging to the Zarnik Dominion parked in orbit around a mining belt in Earth-protected neutral space. Each had transmitted civilian manifests, but now embedded defense cores blinked beneath their hulls, camouflaged installations designed for long-term deployment. The confirmation came from Zarnik's own fleet archive. The document had authenticated itself. Ulick turned toward Commander Turvin. You authorized those ops? They were recon only, Turvin growled. Standard procedure near trade corridors. Holt didn't even glance up. You labeled them humanitarian relief vessels. The chamber plunged into verbal disarray. Accusations surged. Fleet movements, covert trade manipulation, economic tampering. Every delegate's display confirmed a different violation, none by Earth. Holt stood among the storm, still and unbothered. Ulick snapped toward him. You claim you didn't breach our networks? I didn't have to, Holt said. You brought your networks to me. Atrix's tendrils curled into a defensive spiral. This wasn't done with force. This was done with understanding. Holt nodded once. And that's the part that frightens you. Before another voice could rise, the chamber lights dimmed. Idra's central interface pulsed with a deep crimson border, an emergency marker reserved for station-level threats. "Alert," the AI announced. "Multi-sector relay protocol triggered. Transmission cascade exceeds containment thresholds. Class 9 exposure in progress." Silence fell again. Not the silence of tension. This one belonged to inevitability. Ulick's voice was cold. "Shut it down." "Unable," EDRA replied. "Commands originated from valid government keys, layered through learned behavior initiators. Internal override is not authorized." In the silence that followed, Holt ran his thumb once along the ridge of the case. "You built your walls to keep others out," he said. "But you never stopped to wonder who you invited inside by repeating yourselves." No one spoke, because now they understood. They hadn't been hacked. They hadn't been infiltrated. They'd been predicted.
The silence following EDRA's broadcast wasn't just weighted, it was final. Like the last second before gravity gives way beneath a crumbling ledge, each delegate sat frozen before the flickering heads-up displays that continued to populate with classified material. The feeds weren't speculative. These were not interpreted readings. These were verified documents, mapped directly from each delegate's own secure channels. There were no signatures from Earth, no traces of outside access, no signs of tampering, just exposure. Krav Nexon's fingers danced across his console in the control tier. His eyes tracked 3 separate verification chains before he forced himself to sit back, exhaling through clenched teeth. There were no back doors, no hidden worm codes, no trace of Earth-encoded software, every gateway opened using Confederation credentials. Every breach activated by a delegate's own command sequence. He tapped into the station's AI core and brought up the transmission log matrix. There it was again, a pattern he'd seen building for the last hour but refused to believe, trigger strings buried in behavior. Not code, not malware. Protocol tracer hadn't broken into anything. It had waited, it had watched, and then when certain words were said, when specific gestures were made, when delegates leaned forward at the same angle, spoke with expected indignation, when they followed their own predictable paths, it activated. One reaction at a time. Counselor Julik, Krav's voice rang across the chamber, flat with disbelief. This was not an attack. Julik turned toward him, eyes sharp. "Then what do you call this? This orchestrated collapse?" Krav stood. "I call it behavioral mirroring. They didn't breach us. They mapped us." The tension in the room snapped like a stress line through glass. "They used our own operating rhythms," Krav continued. "Patterns in how you argue, in what phrases you repeat, what accusations you launch. The system didn't recognize Earth as a threat because Earth never touched it." Minister Horv Soluin hissed. "You're saying we did this to ourselves?" Krav nodded once. "Every trigger was self-activated. You opened your own gates." Julik's claws curled around the ridge of his terminal. "We've been compromised." Draiven Holt's voice, steady as ever, cut in. "No, you compromised yourselves. We just designed a system that trusted your nature to reveal your intent." Holt stepped away from the center table, not as a gesture of retreat, but clarity. He paced once, slow and deliberate, not as someone forcing dominance, but as someone fully in control of its necessity. "You assumed we'd try to outcode you," he said, his gaze brushing across the delegation like a sculptor inspecting unfinished stone, "that we'd insert something into your networks. You scanned for foreign signals. You hardened your borders. You deployed anti-hack overlays." He stopped. "But your real vulnerability was never your systems. It was your behavior." On the laser plasma displays, new overlays appeared, timeline charts, incident logs, all aligned to specific summit behaviors, blame cycles, accusation tones, body angles during formal protests, tone escalation during interjections. "You think diplomacy is a contest of vocabulary," Holt said. "You never once considered that patterns themselves could be your enemy." Speaker Marn Etrix stared at his display, visibly shaken. "So this protocol tracer, it's not a virus." Holt looked to him with a calm that was almost surgical. "It's a mirror, a silent recorder, watching for habits. The more you pushed, the more your walls crumbled. Envoy Char Voltron shifted, clicking mandibles nervously. This is why you came alone. Not because you lacked force, but because you didn't need any. Vex Taldron's fingers tapped his console rapidly, searching for countermeasures. The station denied every override. No weapon, no uplink, no command channel, he muttered. Just observation. Pre-coded response traps keyed to our own behaviors, not traps, Holt corrected. Reflections. His hand returned to the silver case, still unopened, still untouched. But now its presence loomed large, not for what it might contain, but what it represented. A symbol, a false center. The thing everyone feared, when the real danger was in the lines they had spoken, the gestures they had made, and the assumptions they'd worn like armor. Commander Gore Turbin stood abruptly, voice like a low growl, and if we'd said nothing, if we hadn't followed your little expectations, what then? Then you'd still be pretending to govern a stable galaxy, Holt said, eyes locking with his. But you didn't come here to reason, you came to corner Earth. All I did was leave the lights on. Julek's voice frayed. This is a diplomatic coup. No, Holt said, taking a step back toward the table. This is a diagnostic. He opened the portfolio and laid down a third sheet. This one blank on its face, until the heads-up projectors scanned it and rendered a network map of recent delegate interactions. Comm relays, closed session recordings, pending fleet redeployments, all internal. This data was never ours, Holt continued. It came from your own cycles. Protocol Tracer didn't breach your vaults. It simply watched for when you opened them, to act against us, and recorded what spilled. Etrix whispered. It's not your tools that scare me. It's your understanding. Holt gave a slight nod. That's the part no one prepares for. We didn't match your weapons. We didn't need to. We studied your habits until they became your signal. Krav Nexon's display blinked with one last confirmation. All traced breaches originated through internal initiators. No foreign signal present. Tracer confirmed behavioral cascade success. The analyst closed his console slowly, as if trying not to disturb the balance of an already tilted equation. And in the center of it all, Draiven Holt closed the silver case, never having opened it once. You came here expecting Earth to bring weapons, he said, voice soft enough to echo. We didn't, because the sharpest tools were always yours. He let the words settle. Earth came prepared for who you are. No alarms sounded. No battle music played. There was only the synchronized flicker of laser plasma displays as every delegate watched their own house begin to fall. The war had already started. Gaw Turvin barked a sequence into his fleet command. Uplink. Nothing answered. The command node blinked, stalled, then returned a single line across his heads-up interface. Command route severed, relay disabled. He slammed a scaled fist into the edge of his terminal. Impossible. My battle group's on standby, 3 systems out. They should have responded instantly. Krav Nexon answered without looking up. They won't. The room turned toward him. Your relays are routed through Tier 5 relay stations, the analyst continued, voice hollow. They've been offline for 6 minutes. The Earth fleet disabled them using mirrored bandwidth cloaks. You didn't see the intrusion because it wasn't one. They were already there, on the main console display, a silent visual feed activated without command input. Real-time video from orbital satellites poured across the curved glass panels embedded behind each delegate station. Planetary security zones, storage facilities, hidden dry docks, each one falling, without noise, without mess. Long-limbed drones weaved through space like ribbons of living circuitry, disabling core arrays before automated defense networks could respond. No blasts, no beams, just lights going out and doors sealing shut. A storage ring orbiting Dovar 6 showed 10 Dominion interceptors locked in with tractor braces. A squad of Earth-built slicer drones cut through the hulls in surgical lines, ejecting fusion cores with clean reversals. No damage, no loss of life, just stillness, imposed with terrifying elegance. Gaw Turvin stood again, voice rising. We must initiate contingency counterfire. All sectors, now. Vex Taldron accessed his emergency control slate. I'm trying. Core authority locks won't accept override. Redirect command to your secondary. Turvin snapped. I did, still blocked. Try the blackout protocol. I did that too. Holt remained seated, one hand lightly draped over the closed silver case, as if this were just another policy meeting. You're not under attack, he said, voice clear. You're being contained. Julik stared at the images. This isn't possible. You had no ships in position, no declared fleet operations, no mobilization detected, nothing on scope. We didn't mobilize, Holt replied. We seeded. The center chamber dimmed as Idara's voice returned, but it no longer carried the sterile tone of a neutral intelligence. There was an edge now, a subtle cadence shift, administrative control reassigned, Earth Central Command authentication accepted, override complete. Varn Julik's claws flexed. You compromised the station AI, Holt corrected him without missing a beat. We didn't compromise it, we simply prepared it to respond, when you followed your own script. Across the tiered ring, the laser plasma feeds began to flash with summary panels. Sectors tagged for unsanctioned operations, black sites with unregistered manifests, shadow fleets exposed by proximity surveillance arrays. They'd all been caught not in the act, but in the pattern. Every system you used to keep Earth in check, Holt said quietly. You did so using predictable lines. Same passwords, same fallback positions, same moves. We never needed to break in. We just needed to wait for you to open the doors like you always do when you feel the pressure rise. Envoy Shar Voltron hissed low. This is entrapment. No, Holt said, rising to his feet, his voice calm and terrifying in its restraint. This is exposure. You wanted to corner us. You just didn't account for the fact that Earth doesn't fight like you do. From the chamber ceiling, new footage bled in, a convoy of illegal weapons en route to the barren outer cluster, its signature rerouted through humanitarian beacons. A formation of cloaked probes positioned to scan Earth's defensive satellites, now caught, drifting powerless under Earth's magnetic webline suppression field. The reactions in the chamber fractured. Holt sullen paced. Turvin barked commands that didn't respond. Julik stared at nothing. Only Etrick spoke softly. You've turned our systems against us. Holt shook his head. No, we turned your certainty against you. The silver case remained unopened. It didn't have to be. Its presence alone had served as the perfect misdirection. Every eye drawn to what Holt might carry, never considering what they themselves had already brought to the table. Gore Turvin lunged to the display, stabbing his claw into the compad. Redirect fleet assets to fallback positions. Activate internal defenses. Purge AI relay chains now. Negative ADRA, replied. Fleet relay structure bypassed. Command response suspended under Article 9 Protocol Threat Response Hierarchy, Enforcement. Turvin snarled. Earth doesn't hold command weight under Article 9. Holt finally allowed the faintest trace of a smile. No, but we authored the amendment that made it apply to internal behavioral contagion risks. You all voted it in, 2 cycles ago. The horror on Turvin's face wasn't theatrical. It was dawning comprehension. They had signed their own leash. Across the chamber, several delegates turned to each other, eyes wild, voices lowered. The blame spiral began. Who knew? Who allowed? Who missed what? Holt didn't speak again, until the chamber settled into resigned silence. You thought Earth would come here unarmed, he said, his voice smooth and steady. You were correct. He paused just long enough for the weight of it to land. The weapons were already inside your walls, and this time no one dared argue. You were correct, Holt had said. The weapons were already inside your walls. The room didn't erupt. It unraveled. Varn Julek rose with deliberate slowness, the sheen of restraint cracking beneath the formal mask. His voice, when it came, had lost its theatrical polish, now rough-edged, like stone splintered under heat. Security, he said, gaze fixed on Holt. Place the human under confinement now. Chief Warden Krex Malor stood frozen beside the chamber's auxiliary console. His hand hovered just above the biometric activation plate, hesitant, uncertain. His neural link flared with alert markers, each one blinking erratically in his peripheral. The system didn't respond. Override station lockdown, Julek ordered, sharper now. Level 3 internal threat. Malor touched the panel. Nothing. A denial flash. Then another. Then the audio response from EDRA, the AI's voice subtly deeper, subtly slower. Command rejected. Target not authorized as a security risk. Malor blinked. Run that again. Target profile not categorized under threat index. Detainment is unnecessary. The silence stretched as the meaning settled in. Edra wasn't under council control anymore. Julek turned toward Malor. Then do it manually. Reluctantly, the warden stepped forward. Two security drones unlatched from their ceiling mounts, descending with anti-personnel clamps unfolding. They hovered above Holt, scanning. Neither moved. Drones inactive, Malor muttered. Holt met his eyes. Calm, steady. You can ask them again. They'll decline politely every time. Why? Malor asked, tone unguarded for the first time. Holt nodded toward the chamber ceiling. Because Edra has already redefined threat context. It's not looking at me anymore. It's looking at your intentions. Julek slammed his hand onto the table. You don't get to dictate the law here. You've already broken it, Holt replied. I'm just standing in the wreckage. Suddenly, every heads-up display in the chamber flickered, not to show defense grids or troop logs, but a civilian interface, unsecured, open broadcast. Across a dozen sectors, a ripple began. First one screen, then 20, then 100,000. Every planetary comm node, every regional station, every public news stream received the same transmission. The chamber, the delegates, their votes, their intercepted communiques, their attempts to corner Earth, all of it displayed raw, no commentary, just facts. A woman's voice from a crowd on Thesser Prime. They tried to trap Earth. A news anchor from Volarn. Breaking Confederation leadership plotted containment behind closed doors. Earth's representative revealed internal corruption without a single weapon fired. In real time, council members watched as cities erupted, not in flames but in truth. Demonstrations formed on steps of planetary capitals. Screens replayed Holt's words again and again. We turned your certainty against you. Minister Horv Soloon stood trembling. Shut the broadcast down. Black out the relay. Krav Nexon's response was dry. The relay isn't from Nexus. It's planetary. Each world is choosing to mirror the stream. Voltron growled, clicking low. They're using our own media nodes. No, Krav said. They're using your civilians. Across the chamber, Marn Etrix watched the rising feed tallies. We're losing control. You never had it, Holt said. Vex Taldron turned to Holt, voice desperate, then retracted. Pull your system out. Give us back the compass. You've made your point. Holt looked at the man like a teacher waiting for a student to finish a half-written answer. You don't unring a bell, but you can stop making it worse. The delegates stood at a crossroads with no path forward. Threats would no longer work, they had failed. Diplomacy was a house built on shattered glass, and Earth had not destroyed anything. They had shown the rot already growing beneath the structure. Julek, still standing, tried once more. You've broken galactic order. You've undermined centuries of protocols. This is revolution. Holt stepped forward, voice a hair above a whisper. But it echoed as though the chamber itself had leaned in to listen. This isn't revolution. This is a correction. Another screen blinked into focus behind him. Dozens of species speaking across 1,000 channels. Not in anger, in understanding. The message wasn't about Earth's dominance. It was about the failure of the Council. This ends now, Varn growled. Holt didn't flinch. It ended before I arrived. You just didn't realize it. Krex Malor took a step back from the command console. Hands lowered, eyes wide. Not with fear but with clarity. He understood now why nothing had stopped Holt. Because Holt never moved in force. He moved in reflection. Julek looked around at his fellow delegates. No one stood with him. Not anymore. Earth had conquered nothing. And yet nothing had remained unconquered. I assume, Etrix said softly, that Earth's proposal for equitable diplomacy will arrive soon. It's already been transmitted, Holt replied, to your civilians. They'll decide what kind of council they want to be part of. The obsidian chamber, once built to intimidate, now felt like an emptied throne room, not from destruction, but from displacement. The weight that had once radiated from the 12 council pedestals now hovered elsewhere, just behind the human figure standing at the chamber's center. Draiven Holt adjusted the leather portfolio one final time and opened it with the slow certainty of a surgeon preparing the last stitch. One by one, he drew out thin folders, each bearing a matte black seal marked not with Earth's flag, but a simple symbol, a mirrored arc, bent back upon itself. He stepped to each delegate without ceremony. No flourish was needed. To Varn Julek, a folder, to Marn Etrix another. One by one across the circle, each bore the title, The Earth Doctrine for Behavioral Accord. The document was not a treaty, it was a framework, not a demand, but a condition. It offered cooperation without condition, but layered it with monitoring, accountability, and mirrored systems built to reflect misuse of power back onto the wielder. It did not elevate Earth above others. It ensured no one else could do so unnoticed again. Minister Horv Solun flipped through the first page, his eyes narrowing. This would bind us to behavioral observation protocols. Every diplomatic act, every resource deployment logged and reflected back into a shared archive. That's the idea, Holt said. We learned what happens when too much is hidden, so we've made hiding inconvenient. Gore Turvin snarled, and if we decline, you don't get punished, Holt replied. You just don't get access to Earth's systems, or its defense matrix, or its growing web of allied communications infrastructure. Char-Voltron shoved his folder aside. You think you can shame us into compliance? No, Holt said, gaze level. We think if we give everyone the same visibility, shame will take care of itself. Vex Taldron ran his fingers across the document's embedded strip, a readable chip, fully analog verified. It couldn't be altered. It couldn't be disavowed. It would copy itself into their archives the moment opened. Speaker Etrix closed his folder. You've rewritten diplomacy into a mirror. What's to stop us from misusing even that? Holt considered the question. Nothing, except now, you'll be doing it while watching yourself, and so will everyone else. Varn Julek had said nothing since the delivery. He sat stiffly, claws interlaced. Now slowly, he looked up. The pride was gone. The weight of lost ground clung to him like frost that wouldn't thaw. His voice cracked, not with emotion, but with the exhaustion of a man who no longer saw a viable path forward. What do you want? Holt met his stare. Balance. We're not here to take, we're here to ensure you can't. Above them the laser plasma screens lit again, not with war footage this time, with Earth's internal logs, communications between Holt and Earth Central Command, time-stamped records of every message sent, every attempt to de-escalate, every line where Earth chose not to act, until it had no choice left. Krav Nexon's terminal pinged. He turned it to face the others. These are real, unedited. The station confirms they haven't been manipulated. A single still appeared, Holt's first transmission, long before this summit was called, warning of escalating incursions, asking for dialogue. Ignored. Another Command Director Tholos Rune, authorizing Holt to deploy Protocol Tracer only after 23 warnings had gone unanswered. Julek exhaled. He'd stopped trying to resist. You waited until we gave you permission without realizing we had. Yes, Holt said. And even now you still have the choice to make it right. A soft tone issued across the chamber. The EDR core relit, no longer in defense mode. Instead it projected a single-line extraction clearance. Authorized vessel Arcpost 1 en route. Command Director Rune's voice followed a breath later, low and steady through the comm array. Ambassador Holt, your operation is concluded. Return at your discretion. Holt closed the portfolio and tucked it beneath his arm. He didn't rush. He simply walked toward the sealed chamber doors which opened without announcement. Krex Molor met him halfway, eyes unreadable. You planned all this. We planned to be underestimated, Holt answered. And if we hadn't, then we wouldn't have needed any of it. Molor nodded once and stepped aside. No protest, no regret, only the weight of recognition in his posture. Holt entered the corridor as the doors sealed behind him. One final display hovered above the exit archway, showing a wide-angle image of Nexus Station. A dozen Earth vessels slowly faded from visible spectrum, slipping not away, but into silence. They were still there. They just no longer needed to be seen. Inside the chamber, the Council sat among the ruins of their old structure. Not burned, not broken, just replaced. And far above, on screens spanning thousands of sectors, the people watched. Not because they were told to, but because the truth had finally spoken louder than the broadcast that used to drown it. In the docking bay, Holt climbed the ramp without looking back. He settled into his seat aboard Arcpost 1, the hatch sealed with finality. His voice carried softly into the cabin recorder. No weapons required, just understanding, and the willingness to act when it matters. The ship vanished without a sound.